We'll tell you a little bit about the Democracy Futures Project, where we've been and where we're going. And then we'll try to get everybody up to speed. There are some of you that have participated in different phases of this project, and it looks like others that might be coming to this for the first time. So we won't belabor it, but we want to make sure that we give everybody a shared foundation of information and understanding upon which to build. So we'll try to level set just a little bit. Um, and then we're gonna really get into about 35 minutes or so of how to think about visioning in the future. So during this segment of the agenda, we'll introduce you to different ways to identify trends that might be shaping the future, to use scenarios and scenario planning to prompt thinking about possibilities of the future. We'll discuss different frameworks that futurists use to help think beyond our usual assumptions and sort of our day to day, because it's really hard to get out of the day to day sometimes and think about significant change in the future and what the future could hold. And then we'll hear some snippets from visioning experts to, again, really help us get out of our present moment and think about what could be. Then we'll have some time to really experiment and learn about different innovations and adaptations that are already being used and tested, and in some cases are just proposed to take us into that future. And I think what's really interesting about this part of the agenda is we're not waiting for the future to happen, right? We are already in the future, and people are already testing out and experimenting with different things that could take us into that future. So that will be a really interesting part of the agenda. We're calling it a simulation, but it'll give you a chance to get your hands into some of those innovations. And then finally, we'll do some reflections and next steps. So as you'll see in just a moment, we are getting to the end of this process. And so as we think about landing this plane, so to speak, of the Democracy Futures Project, we want to move into a stage where participants are really internalizing the tools and methodologies and capabilities that we've been trying to teach throughout this process and really bringing them into their organizations. We've also asked participants to think about which part of this agenda do they want to carry forward and where do they need continued support to do that. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the session. Okay, Jonathan's already gone there. So in terms of project goals, again, just to level set, there are two primary goals of the Futures Project. One is to build and expand funders' capacity to work with future and foresight tools. And I think this is really important. We are not trying to come up with the ideal future in this project and then say, okay, this is what we all have to do right now and for the next 5, 10, 15 years to get there. No, this is really about making sure that funders and you all have the skills, the abilities, and the practices to do future thinking within your own organizations. And that's really why we're focusing on the skill building and on the training. And I've really been sharing the products and the scenarios and other things developed during this project with the broader public. And then the second thing that we're hoping to get out is to imagine visions for democracy and identify some of the ideas and innovations that are helping us get there. And so we are going to talk about some of those today, but the idea is really like if there are certain principles or visions of the future that your organization holds, what are the things that you could or should be investing in today that could help get you closer and move you towards that future? Okay, next slide. Okay, in terms of project overview, again, some of you have been with us throughout this whole journey and others are just coming to join the journey today. So I wanted to just say a brief word about where we've been and where we're going. So this project does have 4 phases. We're talking today about phase 3. and really trying to bring the lessons from phase three into the wider circle of people that are here today. But where we started back in October of 2024 was learning about the value and the art of future and foresight thinking with an emphasis on scenario planning. And so, what we did was we looked back at the major developments of the last 25 years to set the stage for how much change is possible in that kind of time frame, and really to get people to identify that in a 25-year window, especially with things changing so rapidly, a lot can happen and the future can look really different in 25 years from now. We also spent quite a bit of time in that first workshop in October, um, scanning the horizon for the big types of trends and forces and dynamics that could shape the future. And so some of the things that we looked at were, major demographic changes and shifts, technological changes and shifts, including AI and how that's going to really influence our democracy and our society going forward, environmental change. So, really just thinking about these big dynamics that are going to have a bearing on the future. Then in March, we got back together and took a deep look at how those forces, individually and combined, could shape American society in 25 years. And during this workshop, because it was March and we were in such a period of turbulence and uncertainty, we did spend some time thinking about how what was happening today could influence the future, as well as making sure that we looked out to 2050. So, some of the things that we were exploring in that workshop were what values and principles are always necessary for a healthy democracy, even as our social trends and norms evolve. Secondly, what is the nature of America's current political realignment? What is driving that, and what does that mean for the future? And then we talked a lot about what does it mean to govern effectively when you're experiencing really rapid and profound change at the federal level. So then, after we grounded the conversation in the present and understanding those forces, we turned to scenario planning. And I think it's really important to mention that we played around with these different scenarios, but scenarios are not meant to be a blueprint or a prediction of the future. We use those scenarios to really get people to examine the assumptions that they're bringing to the table and to get us all prepared to adapt to really significant changes that are happening to us all the time. And what we did when we were looking at those different scenarios was really try to identify, regardless of how those forces combine to create those future scenarios, there are some things that are going to be essential for democracy no matter what. So we really try to tease out those things. And some of the things that participants identified were moral and courageous leadership, effective governance mechanisms, and making sure that there were feedback loops between governing institutions and citizens, a clear, compelling future for what democracy looks like. So, really, a vision that people could anchor themselves to. And we talked a lot about shared trust and belief in science, research, and shared facts. The importance of having a literate, engaged, and critical thinking population. So, there were a couple of things that we really pulled out that we thought were absolutely essential to democracy, no matter what shape it all takes. And then that's where workshop three picked up, really trying to discuss how how we can innovate in order to bring about those principles and those values that are shared. So in workshop three, we discussed how to act on, engage with a range of possibilities. So we explored mechanisms of how visioning processes have been undertaken in other contexts. We considered innovations, adaptations, and emerging practices from citizen assemblies to ministers for the future to understand the potential benefits and downsides of those adaptations for democracy. And then we explored what would be necessary to advance some of these values and ideas. And that's what we're going to try to do with you all today in a much abbreviated form, is really replicate some of those conversations that we had in workshop 3. And then the final stage of this is we're getting back together in September to land the plane, so to speak. And in that session, we'll really be spending quite a bit of time looking at how do participants internalize these tools and these lessons and their practices into their own organizations, so that they and their organizations are future ready. Next slide. Okay. To get us started and to get you all kind of thinking about the future, and getting you away from your day-to-day, which can be quite difficult. We wanted to give you all this question and think about what is something that exists now that may not exist in 20 or 25 years from now. So just to tease this out, it could be something like free public education may not exist in 25 years, or let's say a free, free press at the community level. So just think about things. It could be positive, it could be negative, that exist now that may or may not exist in the future. And we'll take some time to do that. And then we're not going to come back and report out, but we will share some of those ideas in the chat.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had meaningful and robust discussions. We will not share verbally as a full group right now, but I do invite you to put in the chat what you discussed as something that exists now, but might not exist in 20 to 25 years, might not exist at all, or certainly might not exist in the way that we currently understand it. And as you all do that, I'm going to move us to the next portion of our agenda, which is a question about how we think about the future. Futuring is both an art and a science. It is about what we're thinking about. It's also about how we're thinking about it. And so we wanted to spend a few minutes talking about how to think about and envision the future in ways that are about tools and inputs and ways that are about principles and processes. And so, as Shannon so artfully described for us at the top of the call, a couple of modalities of futures and foresight thinking that we've been using are trends and scenarios. So trends being looking at the trend of climate change, the trend of changing gender norms, the trend of religiosity and religious institutional decline, and what might the impacts of those be on governance. We also looked at some scenarios, which, as Shannon told us, are provocative visions, not predictions, but provocative speculations about what the future could look like in ways that might challenge some of our preconceptions and underlying assumptions. What we're going to turn to next is I'm going to invite 3 of our brilliant committee members. We're so lucky through this project to have both a steering committee and an advisory committee. So I'm about to turn it over to them to share a little bit about some of the processes that we used and learned about in workshop 3. First, I'm going to turn it over to Aditi Juneja with Democracy 2076, and she's going to talk to us about a framework that we found really helpful called the 3 Horizons framework. Then I'm going to turn it over to Nick Walker from Stand Together and Kelly Bourne from the Packard Foundation to talk about what we learned from some visioning experts who have done this work and what those processes have looked like. So Aditi, why don't you take it away from here?
Sure. If we have a slide of the 3 horizons, I can explain it if that's helpful, and also just talk a little bit about how we've used it. So I first learned this framework in 2023, and I was like, whoa, this is why I'm having such a hard time communicating with people that I know, because we're thinking about the world in really different ways. And so the idea of the three horizons is you have no worries. Do you want to show the three horizons so I can walk us through it? Or maybe am I just not? Oh, I'm just not
Should
seeing
be
it.
on the screen right
Oh,
now, Dee.
yeah, sorry. I was in the meeting tab. So as you can see in the first horizon, it's the kind of current state. So the system that is most prevalent, it's at the top of this. And as you can see, that system is often in decline. And so in thinking about this, it's like if you think about people who work very much within the existing system, people who are making sure our social security checks get delivered, people who are teachers in schools, they are very much part of the existing system. And so their incentives and fears are very much around preserving the existing system. I think it's also interesting to think about where a lot of the folks who started pro-democracy organizations came from. Many of them came from very much working within existing systems. Horizon 2 is sort of more innovative ideas. And as you can see, they often are incremental ideas that work within the system and they reach a peak and then they start to decline. So I think about the example I've given when talking about this is like the ACA. So in 2000, the ACA would have seemed like a very nascent idea on this early part of the curve. By 2012, it's like at its peak top of implementation. And now the ACA, I would say, is on this downward slope where, because it has become the new status quo, it is now a system that is being criticized in decline, where people are like, we need to do more. This system is running out of runway. And then Horizon 3 are pockets of new ideas and innovations and experiments, which we're going to hear about a lot on this call. And there are things that might be happening in smaller pockets around the country, around the world, often happening in our own communities, especially for the place-based funders on this call, that haven't yet reached national scale, that maybe there's no journal article about, but where people are starting to experiment with new ideas and new ways of being. And then often those become more prominent. I think what's useful about this, and when we trained our set of partners on this, it was about 30 folks, it was about 50 folks from across 30 states. Two reflections that came up. One was folks feeling like so much of the work they're doing is Horizon 1 work, where they're preserving and protecting existing institutions. They're like, sometimes we do Horizon 2 work. And then folks were like, Horizon 3 people aren't talking to us. And then they sort of had this aha of being like, maybe there aren't Horizon 3 people. Maybe we need to become the Horizon 3 people, which was sort of like an eye-opening moment. And I think at the last PACE gathering, I heard funders say something very similar, that they feel like 70 to 90% of their work is in this Horizon 1 bucket, and they're not even sure where to really find the Horizon 3 bucket and which of their grantees are doing it and are excited to do it. So grantees don't know who will fund it, and funders don't know which grantees are doing it. So that was kind of funny. I think the final thing I'll just offer is that I think that these three horizons are cyclical, which is to say what is Horizon 3 now can become Horizon 1 in the future. And so we talked about civil rights leaders, for example, at the start of the civil rights era would have been very much in this early pocket of Horizon 3, and now they're probably Horizon 1. And so I was saying for myself that I am very much looking forward to being a Horizon 1 person in 30 years and being cranky about the kids and the innovation that they're trying to do. Whereas right now, I think that my work is very much in this Horizon 3 space. And so I just offer that to say that this is not static. And I think what's valuable about it is to think about the interconnection of these things. It's useful to think about across a portfolio, is it balanced? But it's also valuable to think about how these folks who are working across these different horizons can communicate with one another and support one another, and be kind to one another. Because I think often some of the challenges that we have in our strategy approaches and the tensions come from folks who are sitting in different horizons and with different vantage points. Was that what you were looking for, Kristen? Did I?
It was perfect, Aditi. You nailed it. 10 out of 10, no notes. Thank you so much. We're going to have an opportunity to chat a little bit as a group with Aditi and with Kelly and Nick. But next, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly and Nick. So as I mentioned, we really tried to think about this workshop as a question of how we vision. what does the process for that look like? How do we get our brains in that mode? And so the mental model that Aditi just shared with us of Three Horizons was really helpful in unlocking for a lot of folks. We also brought in two really brilliant experts working in two very different contexts to talk to us about the processes that they've run, what those processes looked like, what the design choices were, what the results were, how they brought people together. And so we wanted to share a little bit of their brilliance and their thinking with you all, which we're going to do through two of our steering committee members. First, we'll turn it over to Kelly Bourne, and then we will have Nick Walker, and they will talk to us about the lessons that we learned from our two brilliant futurists. Sophie Howe, who was the first Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, and Jerry Hawkins, who is a futurist with Future Good and ran a process in Dallas. So with that, I will turn it over to Kelly, who can then pass it on to Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Happy to. Um, so it was really helpful to bring in some practitioners who have spent time in the space and have really become experts in helping communities build positive visions. They had really different vantage points. So Sophie, as Kristen mentioned, was the first Future Generations Commissioner in the world in Wales, and she really helped Wales create a shared vision and a framework for what their future should look like. And so they came up basically with a set of 7 interconnected goals, goals around health or environmental outcomes, things like this. But what was really interesting and unique about the process was both how they created it and then how they used it. And so it wasn't, in terms of how it was used, it wasn't just a vision or a set of principles. It actually had teeth. There was an act that it supported to guide legislative decision making and basically required the Welsh government to meet today's needs without compromising the well-being of future generations. And they went about it in a pretty, I thought, interesting way, in terms of how they gathered input to inform the act. So they had a pretty diverse set of practices that they used to gather input. They had school children writing letters to their future selves. They had reverse mentoring programs between young leaders and senior executives. They had folks using Minecraft to actually design ideal future communities. And I had talked to Sophie about it at a different point, and she had mentioned the whole thing only cost $300,000 or $400,000. They basically engaged, they were operating at a pretty different scale, so they engaged 7,000 Welsh citizens in a population of, I think, 3.5 million. So operating at a pretty different scale, but really managed to have a very inclusive process that ultimately had very concrete impacts. And I think the one that Sophie mentions most frequently is when she was presented with a bill to build a new highway system in Wales and vetoed that out of a view that it both wasn't going to support the interests of future generations, but it also didn't even really meet the needs of current generations, given how many Welsh citizens couldn't afford cars or wanted access to other kinds of transportation. And ultimately, in 2021, this resulted in Wales basically making the decision to permanently halt any major new road construction or to require just much stricter criteria for future projects. And the last thing I would say about what Sophie shared was a couple of lessons from her experience that I thought were really relevant for us as well. One was to focus on goals and values and not get anywhere near specific solutions to problems at that stage, but to really allow people to vision. Um, a second was around letting 1,000 flowers bloom. And so really using a bunch of different visioning techniques. So I mentioned Minecraft and letters and, just finding a bunch of different ways because different citizens and audiences engage or relate to different kinds of tools differently. A third was just providing a lot of training to help people navigate between current problems and future visions. I think, as we experienced in this problem as well, it's really hard to get people to step away from the current moment and get really big picture to think creatively about the future. And the last one that I really appreciated was keeping some distance from but connection to government. And so their project was government funded, but run and administered by civil society. And the benefit of that was that it had grassroots legitimacy because it was run by civil society, but it also wasn't just some random white paper that ended up on a desk somewhere. There was government buy-in from the beginning. So that was what Sophie shared. And then Jerry joined us from Dallas, and he had really helped set the visioning process there. He, as Kristen mentioned, was with Future Good, but he was also the expert helping lead Kellogg Foundation's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Initiative in Dallas. And they started, interestingly, from a pretty different place of really focusing on retelling the history of Dallas. So grappling with, artifacts and articles from the past to really help people re-understand or re-narrate what the history of Dallas was and to understand the roles that immigrant populations, Native Americans, many different kinds of citizens had played in the formation of Dallas. And it was only after that kind of grappling with and re-understanding the history of the community that they turned to more longer term future visioning kind of work. And he shared, I think, 4 lessons from that I think really resonated with a lot of us. One was to make narrative change a central component of the project to really help people see themselves and their visions of what is possible. They were asking residents questions like, how do you want Dallas to look and feel? So less of a technocratic and more of a sort of visioning approach. Um, he thought it was really, really, really important to not start by discussing the current reality or baseline state. So sort of similar to Sophie's, like don't get stuck in the policy or the current problems. Really instead talk about the ideal future first. And that allows people to share their sort of dreams and identify signals for how you might make some of that possible. He talked a lot about how they managed to engage a lot of different citizens. They used public libraries as infrastructure to reach everyone from young people to teachers and elders and unhoused populations. And then finally, he had a point that I think is probably useful for all of us all the time, which was just being very generous with giving credit and letting people take his ideas or their project's ideas and just run with them. And I think the last thing I would say was just interesting to hear the really concrete results that they had there as well. My understanding was they ultimately established a $20 million racial equity office and the first racial equity plan in the South. And then at the same time, they created a historical cultural preservation strategy and a plan to ensure acknowledgement of Indigenous communities in and Indigenous land in city documents. So I think I'll stop there, Kristen, or others who were there. I don't know if folks have something that they would add, but those were highlights that we took away.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was a really helpful snapshot and synthesis of a lot of brilliance that was shared with us. And I put, in case folks don't have them already, I put the playlist to the videos of the speakers' remarks in the chat, as well as the summaries from the first 3 workshops. So those will each give you a little bit more detail, but that was a wonderful high-level summary. Nick, what would you add to that?
Yeah.
Both either from what you heard from Sophie and Jerry, or maybe some of your own reflections as well.
Yeah, that's great. I thought a lot about, Kelly covered a lot of maybe the substantive pieces there, but I thought I'd pull out maybe some themes, similar things that jumped out, and maybe how it has impacted my thinking in this space. I also thought a lot about how some other speakers that came right after them, particularly Gideon, helped really kind of shape my thinking here. So I thought I'd kind of discuss that a bit. The thing that struck me about Sophie's discussion that Kelly really brought out here was this point around focused on principles, not policy, and being like government oriented, but not like embedded within it, right? Like not so focused on as an institution. And I think this is like a critical point to think about when we think about democracy as like an institution, is that it's not solely about government. It's about like sort of this ecosystem of actors and institutions that sort of operate together. And it also is like this focus on principles, not policy, I think is a really helpful reminder of particularly for philanthropy, but I think for anyone thinking about sort of the health of democracy, we want to think about what is the system that we want in place, right? Like, and what are the principles we want it to abide by? I think it is very easy in this particular space to be have a recency bias, right? And assume that whatever the policy outcomes we're wrestling with or whatever election outcomes are more recent, is that like these are somehow the status quo. And in some instances, like there are real challenges that have to be dealt with. But there is I think it's critically important to say and agree upon, hey, what is it that we want our democratic institutions to deliver for us? What are the institutions and systems that allow it to do that? And making sure that whatever we do, we sort of focus on that, which I think it sort of forces us to think about this on a longer time horizon, which I think is sort of this point of like future visioning to begin with is, hey, can we all agree upon the kind of rules of the game, as I would say, maybe, that gets us to a better place? And if we can agree upon that, it kind of frees us up to think less about what is currently a problem or what the current tailwinds even are, but to think more about like where we need to go and what that needs to look like, sort of irrespective of the like current political outcomes or current election outcomes. And I think pulling on Josh spoke a bit about this too. He's the executive director of People Powered. He framed this up as, I think the term that he used was focus less on like specific kind of silver bullet innovations and think about this as like a healthy ecosystem of activities. And this, can include a wide variety of things that might look like citizen assemblies or electoral reform or, budgeting arrangements, more local government engagement, more community engagement, and all of these things are in service of sort of a democratic ecosystem. I think that there is a tendency within this like philanthropy space to find specific opportunities and think and assume that like they're going to drive long-term reform, and they may in some instances, but it's also important that we think about like the very healthy, like what's a healthy ecosystem of interventions we're putting on the table, knowing that like some of them are going to be work, some of them are not probably going to work, and having like the intellectual humility, I think, to think about that. In our own work, we've come to this recently from a funding perspective in thinking about things like congressional reform. And what I've realized is like this is a very crowded space, like a lot of ideas about what would make Congress more effective in sort of their role in legislating and conducting oversight. And I realized after a while, I was like, I'm not going to actually arrive at a solution that says, oh, if only Congress did X, right? So let's put all of our eggs in that basket. It's really about how do we empower an ecosystem of folks who are delivering a vision-aligned message that is essentially like, hey, if we want a more effective governance system, Congress needs to be more effective in legislating. Here are 10 different options that may be effective in that regard. And that's really informed like our grant making strategy really directly. Instead of trying to over-engineer and assume that we can come up with the answers, we assume that we can craft a vision for an ideal state, and then we can find people who share that vision, even if we're not clear on exactly which of the outcomes are going to be the winners. Jerry's, there were a couple of things that Kelly hit on here that I thought Jerry pulled out that were really helpful and have been informative for me. One is this point about, he talked about conducting like a really comprehensive community vision process and asking, what is it that you want Dallas to be, right? Like, how do you want to feel about the city and how do you want it to look? And he wedded this together with this notion of like narrative matters when we're thinking about things like democratic reform, in that institutions and like procedural things are one aspect of the work that we often do, but like people comprise those institutions, and it matters how they feel about them and how they think about them, whether or not they trust them or mistrust them. And if there's not a level of buy-in, then like you can sort of organize all of the rules by the way that like on paper seems optimal, but if people don't trust them to deliver or view that is in their best interests, it's probably actually not going to be a long-term effective strategy. And I thought that Jerry's discussion like really pulled that out for me in terms of thinking about our own grant making, that from a very like on the ground perspective is like we've pivoted from thinking about a lot of our work as like institutions only and thinking about it as like norms and institutions, right? Because the two things are intersecting and matter in a lot of ways. The last thing I'll say is maybe a little bit about Gideon, because he walked us through a really interesting exercise of imagining like, what is the world going to be? I think it was like 50 years, maybe. It was like, you could sort of see yourself in it, but it was kind of a distant future. And there was a lot of hypotheticals around the way in which people interact with information, they communicate with each other, whether or not they go out in the world or they stay at home. And all of them were like kind of vanilla in the sense of like, they could be good or bad, but I thought he did a really good job of creating hypotheticals that says, there's going to be change, right? Like no matter how we think about this. And those changes are going to be a mixture of good and bad, depending on what you're optimizing for. And it's instructive even in this breakout group that we had where we asked this question, and we came up with this pretty long list of things that may or may not exist in the future, that I thought Gideon touched on as well, which is things like the provision of education. What does the job market look like with the existence of AI? What does like the human condition look like with the advance of medical science, which is like on net good probably, but like for a social security program, that seems really challenging, right? Because we're gonna have people living 100, 110, 120 years in a system that's not built to fund those things, right? We have a birth rate decline in the US. There's lots of ways you could think about that, but it's going to create changes in the system. And the more he walked through all of these different innovations, it made me realize that the change is inevitable. It's nearly impossible to predict like the positive and negative externalities of all of those changes, which to me like reinforces this position to say like we have to anchor ourselves in principles and institutions and sort of like rules in a long-term trajectory. Because if we think that we can sort of map out what the next 20 or 25 or 50 years is going to look like in terms of intricate policy, we'd just be wrong, right? Because like the way in which innovation is happening sort of precludes us from having that knowledge. So those are some of like the things that I took away from those discussions that I thought some of them reinforced positions I had previously and helped me articulate them better. And in other instances, it made me think about things in a different way and has actually changed the way in which I think about grant making and investment.
Love to hear that, Nick. Thank you so much. It was really helpful to hear you both talk a little bit about, the summary of what you heard, but also how you're internalizing it and what meaning you're making from it and the impact and influence it's having on the way that you do your work. I now want to open it up for some discussion in the second half, this 90-minute session. In the last 30 minutes, we're going to talk more about Gideon and Josh. I'm so glad Nick previewed some of that for us. We're going to talk a little bit more about what the innovations, what the R&D lab for democracy looks like and different things that folks are working on. But let's pause for a moment now and dig into this how question a little bit more. Let's just open it up for discussion. What questions do you have about what you've heard, whether it's from Shannon or Aditi, Kelly, Nick, or anything that you might have picked up from the session summaries? Well, maybe to get us started, Aditi, I know that you have done work on this like principles versus policy and like ways of thinking versus mandates or rigidity. How do you think about that, and what does that look like in the context of your work at Democracy 2076?
Yeah, I think something that both Nick and Kelly highlighted was starting with the vision of where you're trying to go, as opposed to sort of starting with a problem assessment. And when we gathered folks in December of 2023, it was around what should the Constitution look like in 2076? What will it need to look like? And we put people through a set of different scenarios, as well as projections for like, with climate change, with demographic shifts, with income inequality, like what do we want our governance to look like? And I think what was really helpful about that was we were not at a policy level. So you could imagine it would be easy to get into immigration policy or climate change policy or whatever. The question we were asking is, what do we need to do between now and then at a constitutional level? So that's at a government level. So our institutions can be, and the three words we used for values were effective, responsive, and representative. And so the thing we were setting out were values of effective, responsive, and representative government. And then it was a question of how we make our institutions able to handle the changes. And I think to Nick's point about the intersection between institutions and people and the norms that are set amongst people, I think it was helpful to be thinking about, okay, well, what do we want them to be able to do? For example, if 80% of the country agrees on a policy position, we want our legislature to pass that policy position, for example. And so that's not how our government currently works. And so that I think that the longer time horizon, as Nick was saying, was really helpful in sort of creating the veil of ignorance, because I think a lot of times when we ground it in the present, people are thinking about how can the party I agree with get power? How can the people that are marginalized in the present have more power? And on a 50-year time horizon, who you're talking about as being marginalized, as not having power, there's a lot you don't know about who that's going to be. And so then you need a system that works for everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Aditi. Particularly as demographics are shifting and as the economy, and I noticed a couple of the things that people talked about in the chat about things that might go away is the way we think about cash, the way we think about capitalism, the way the economy runs. So all really important to think about, challenging our assumptions about what marginalization will look like in the future. Who else has a question or a comment or a reflection about what you've heard before we move to the next part of the agenda?
I guess thinking, building on what Aditi just said, like how to avoid overly, I guess, thinking more in terms of Horizon 1 of like, these are the issues, these are the trends we're seeing right now. You know, let's just say like the rise of AI and, you know, the way it's severely depleting water and using up energy, basically baking in our commitment to destroying our climate. So how much do we kind of think of, well, what are the current trends? And more to what Aditi was saying, like, all right, regardless of what's happening now, where do we want to get to? And then do, like, instead of kind of thinking of it passively as like, we're just trying to study the trends and think of where we might end up, thinking more of what is the future we're trying to reach. So like what Aditi was saying, this future of a responsive democratic government that reflects the will of the people, regardless of the current trends, and then thinking of what are the policy things or changes that would help us get to that future as opposed to the other futures. So I guess I'm just thinking of like, it's partly like navigating, like how much can we bracket that Horizon 1 stuff?
Yeah, I can, or do you have somebody to that, or I'm happy to?
Go ahead.
I mean, that's a question that we have thought a lot about, even as we were building out this part of our portfolio. And our argument has been you need all of it, right? You do need to have some in kind of every horizon. And that what we wanted to do was sort of take a step back and look at where is the field oriented overall. And it felt like the vast majority of folks in the democracy space were very heavily focused in Horizon 1 and a little bit in Horizon 2, and there was very little in Horizon 3. And so the argument that we made to our board, at least, was can we support the field in rebalancing that a little bit? Not to get 100% to Horizon 3 and just like hope today kind of works out, but to get to something closer to 10 or 20% of the field's overall resources and mind share going to Horizon 3. Thinking for some organizations that might be, doing all Horizons 3 work if they look at the field and say no one in their sector is doing that at all. For others where there's a lot more of that work happening, maybe it's less, but that it was more of a portfolio assessment than anything.
But just to add on to that, Jeff, your thing about like, how do you do it practically when you're doing the exercise? I think that that's where having different scenarios of the future are helpful, because then you're not having to make predictions about, are we going to continue on a path of authoritarianism, or is there going to be some course correcting shift that leads us back to democracy, or whatever the issue or the area is that folks care about. By having scenarios, you're not having to predict the future. And what's valuable in thinking about how to invest in your portfolio, as Kelly was saying, how to be balanced, is that you can then say like, well, what were the common ideas we want no matter what happens? Like, regardless of the scenario we're in, there's probably some set of stuff we want to see in the future regardless, and maybe that's the stuff we spend our time focused on or investing in. But to Kelly's point, I think if you're trying to balance your portfolio to go from 99 to 1%, from not to 90 to 10, you don't even necessarily as a funder have to have that analysis. You can be like, is there anyone doing any of that work? And that's where the experimentation can start, because it's not like there's a huge field of people doing long-term oriented work to pick from.
I think, Jeff, you are also inherently making the case for work in Horizon 2. Like, it's easy to think about, okay, Horizon 1 being where we are now, Horizon 3 being where we want to be. What you described is really the work of Horizon 2 and how you get from one to the other. And so as much as we've been talking about that kind of those ends of the spectrum, I think it is important to think about, what does that middle space look like? How do we live in that liminality and that uncertainty? And that's a little bit of where innovations and R&D come into play. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and partner in this work, Jonathan Starr, to talk a little bit about some of the signals and signposts that we got about ways that people are trying to work to move us into that future state. So some of the Horizon 2 thinking. And we'll talk a bit more about Gideon and Josh, Gideon and Josh's reflections in this section too, and show a little video. So with that, Jonathan, why don't you take it away from here?
Kristen, thanks very much, and thanks all for the great inputs and the comments on this question of, how do we get to a vision, and how do we kind of balance this idea between Horizon 1 and Horizon 3. And as Kristen said, in many ways, the second half of this workshop 3 that we ran a few weeks ago was all about the idea that interesting things and experimental and innovative things are happening in and around democracy. And yet at the moment, they have a relatively low profile. They may well end up being something that is much more significant, that kind of moves us towards a Horizon 3 and, as Aditi said, become Horizon 1 in the future. But at the moment, they're a little more under the radar. And so we wanted to bring in a couple of people who could speak authoritatively about some of these innovations. And so our first speaker was Gideon Litchfield, and Gideon was the editor-in-chief of Wired, MIT Technology Review, was also a writer and a foreign correspondent for The Economist. And Gideon now spends most of his time focused on questions around the future of democracy. And he has a Substack called Futurepolis, which I'm sure many of you follow. If you don't, kind of take a look at it. But Gideon was a great contributor, and I want to show a video in a moment or two about the work that he'd put together to kind of prompt us to think about the future. We also heard from Josh Lerner. Josh is the co-executive director of People Powered, and focused a lot on the work that he's done there around ideas like participatory budgeting that empowers people to decide together how to spend kind of public money. So very much a kind of a classic innovation and an early development of what we might see as new forms of democracy. And we were particularly interested in Josh's work because he had this concept of saying democratic innovations or innovations around democracy, we've always thought about them coming in waves. But as Nick said earlier, we really should be thinking not about waves, but about ecosystems. Democracy and how it forms in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years is going to be an amalgamation of a lot of different ideas. And so Josh brought a lot of those kind of perspectives about what the ecosystems might be into the room. What Gideon did was he also thought about what are the things that could be kind of connected together. And he put together a little story, a scenario effectively about what the future could look like. And so I'm gonna play Gideon's video here about him presenting this. It's going to be about, I think, 9 or 10 minutes long, but I think it's worth watching in its entirety. And what we'll then do is go and think about a couple of these innovations specifically, think about what the pros and cons might be from there. So I'm going to press play. I'm going to hope that this kind of audio comes through on your side as well. And I'm sure I'll get a thumbs up if it is doing that. So listen out for Gideon's picture of democracy in the future.
And so I want to tell you a story. I'd like you to come with me for a moment to the year 2040. And I would like you to meet Sandra. Sandra lives in a small city in Michigan. She's a new mother. Her kid is nearly a year old. And she has a morning routine. She gets up, she feeds her child, and then she sits in the kitchen, makes herself coffee and breakfast, and she listens to her personalized, 5-minute personalized news podcast from her AI assistant, Harry. Now, she named Harry after Prince Harry because Harry had a midlife crisis. He started a punk band. Sandra's a huge fan. So Harry reads her this news podcast that is personalized to her interests, and he can do that because he has access to lots of her data. He has access to her social media, to her news browsing habits, to her email. Yes, in 2040, people still use email. And she's comfortable giving him that access because there is a strong data privacy goal. And it says that Harry can not only not share her data with other third parties, he can't even share her data with the AI company that created him for their training models. He is completely self-contained. He exists only to serve Sandra. So Harry reads her news podcast, and there are items about flooding in Florida, where Sandra's mother lives. There is something on Michigan state taxes. There's some new science on nutrition for toddlers. Obviously, she's interested because she has a kid. And then he says something that makes her stop and pay attention. Because it turns out that there is a bill before the House of Representatives to license AI psychotherapists on a par with human ones. And to Sandra, this is pretty personal. She has a friend, Paul. She grew up at school with him. He has had mental health struggles all his life. He's poor. He doesn't have good health insurance. And he's never been able to get a decent therapist. And she's always been worried about him. And so when Harry mentioned this bill about AI psychotherapy, she said, wait, go deeper, tell me more. So Harry gives her another minute on this story. And the bill was proposed by a House of Representatives who similarly had relatives with mental health problems. Patient advocacy groups are in favor of it. Medical profession, unsurprisingly, is against. In health insurers are split. And so after telling her this information, Harry says to Sandra, so what do you think? And Sandra thinks for a minute and she says, well, I want people like my friend Paul to have access to therapy, but I guess I'm worried that, I don't know, maybe these AI therapists will be badly programmed or something. So I suppose I want to know what the safeguards would be. And Harry says, okay. Do you want me to send that feedback to Congress? And Sandra says, yeah. Over the next 30 days, which is the public comment period of this bill, 4 million people will send feedback to Congress on the proposal. Some of them will do it by talking to AI assistants like Harry. Some of them will post videos on social media. Some of them will even write letters the old-fashioned way. The Congressional Research Service will ingest all of this data and it will crunch it. It will identify that there are half a dozen main opinion viewpoints from across the population. And it will condense each of those viewpoints into an AI avatar and a digital person that you can speak to. And these avatars can explain the main arguments for that viewpoint. They can also delve into personal stories and anecdotes from all of the people whose data was fed into them. Politicians can talk to these avatars and they can get to know the opinion of members of the public in a really granular way, much more so than through opinion polls. Members of the public can talk to them as well, and they can learn about the opinions of people with different views from theirs. And it turns out people really like talking to these avatars because they're designed to be personable and funny, and they have all sorts of interesting stories. And so they really contribute to this kind of national discourse about licensing AI therapists, which then feeds into the deliberations that members of Congress have. All right, so Harry's finished reading the news, and now he has some agenda items for Sandra. First of all, he tells her that the IRS has generated her tax return for her. The tax return is auto-generated because the IRS has access to her W-2s and 1099s. It has access to her bank account. Once again, there are privacy laws to make sure that the government can consolidate this data in a way that it is not abused. And by the way, this is a thing that really happens today in 2025, just not in the US. It also has access to hospital records, and so it knows she had a child in the last year. So it has automatically added the child tax credit to her tax return. And Harry says to Sandra, do you want to check your tax return before it's filed? And normally Sandra would check it, and past years she has. She's never found any problems. And right now she's way too busy with her new child. So she says, no, you know what, just file it. Harry says, okay. Next, he updates her on what's been going on the local message boards. So these message boards are incredibly active. People are talking about all the stuff that's going on in the local community. There's way too much to keep up with. But every morning, Harry gives Sandra a very, very quick summary of what are the main issues on the boards, what her neighbors have been talking about. It's a good way for just keep a figure of the pulse of the community, what's on people's minds, make those sorts of connections. She can obviously go deeper anytime she wants on any issue, but today there's nothing that really catches her attention. So they move on. The next issue is zoning. There is a new zoning ordinance for small businesses coming up. There's a vote on it. And Harry says to Sandra, how do you want to vote? Now, to be frank, Sandra doesn't know much about zoning. To be honest, she could care less about it. And so when Harry asks her how she wants to vote, she says, well, I don't know. And Harry says, well, okay. But it turns out your friend Carmen Sanchez has offered herself to be a proxy on the zoning question. Would you like to delegate your vote to her? Now, this is a form of what's called liquid democracy. The city has decided that if there is a vote coming up and you have a vote, but you don't know much about the issue, but there is someone else whose opinion you trust, you can delegate your vote to them and they will exercise the vote on your behalf. And so when Sandra hears that Carmen Sanchez is offering herself as a proxy, so let me tell you about Carmen Sanchez. Carmen Sanchez is she's the queen of zoning, all right? She can cite every zoning ordinance in the city going back 30 years. She lives and breathes this stuff. And so when Sandra hears that Carmen Sanchez is offering herself up as a proxy, she says, hell yes, I'm going to let Carmen take my vote and decide what needs to be done about zoning. And then I do not have to think about this thing again. So Harry says, all right, Carmen has your vote. The final item that Harry has for her is trash. And trash is something that Sandra really does care about. The city has had a problem with trash in the center for years. There have been Democratic mayors, there have been Republican mayors, there's been an independent mayor. Somehow nobody has managed to get their hands around the trash bowl. And it got so bad that 2 years ago, the city convened a citizens panel, a group of 40 people chosen by sortition, which is to say by lottery, to be randomly chosen, but a representative group across the city, different backgrounds, different political views. And it brought them together for a weekend. And had them listen to expert testimony about trash. It then allowed them to come up with proposals. Somebody said, well, we should just hire more trash collectors. And someone else was like, well, how do we pay for those? So then they had a debate about maybe taxing local businesses that sell things in plastic packaging. And then someone else said, well, what if we just made high schoolers do 8 hours of community service a year picking up trash? And somebody else said, well, what if we just use the surveillance cameras at traffic intersections to identify people who are dropping litter and fine them? Anyway, so there's a lot of proposals going around, some are a little crazier than others, but eventually through a facilitated process, they deliberate, they come up with a common proposal. That proposal is then put out in the community message boards. There's more debate, there's voting, there's discussion, people have their own ideas. Finally, a refined proposal is sent to the city council, which adopts it. And that was 1 year. And now the trash plan, which has been operating for a year, is up for review. Because another thing the city does is it has outcomes-based legislation. Whenever it passes a new ordinance, that ordinance has to have goals, performance goals attached to it. And it has to undergo the periodic review. And if it is not meeting its goals, the city has to revise it. And if it is not revised within a certain period of time, it automatically lapses. So the trash ordinance is up for its performance review. And Harry says to Sandra, what do you think? Is the trash problem any better? And Sandra's like, are you kidding me? Have you seen the city center? Hell no, it's way worse. And Harry says, okay, would you like me to send that feedback to the city council? And Sandra says, hell yes, you should send them that feedback. And so her feedback, exactly as she said it, is going to be sent to the city council along with that of thousands of other people. And that is going to factor into their deliberations on how to deal with the trash problem better. So Sandra has listened to the news, she's filed her taxes, she has committed no less than 3 acts of civic duty, civic participation. And it has taken her 10 minutes. And now she could get on with the rest of her day. And so I want to tell you a story. I'd like you to come.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening to the Gideon's video of Sandra there. Hopefully you were able to pick up that there's plenty of what we might call Horizon 2 innovations that we can kind of already see. We know about things like the way in which e-governance is starting to work in various places, such as Estonia. There was ideas there about citizen agents. There were ideas about privacy laws. And so what Gideon was able to do was to basically put that into a simulation, a scenario that allowed us to say, yes, we could imagine ourselves in those kinds of situations. So what we did back in workshop 3 was then to say, Josh has talked about a lot, Gideon has talked about a lot, but there are many, multiple different kind of new developments and innovations that are happening around the democracy space. And we presented a number of very kind of short form innovations to our participants in the workshop. And you can see there we broke them into various different categories. So there were innovations around representation and authority, such as legislative review. Gideon just talked about that in terms of we may well see sunset clauses on different pieces of legislation. Civic participation and direct democracy. Participatory budgeting, Josh talked about that. Citizen agents, citizens assemblies, lots and lots of innovations around that, and we kind of put those into the mix. Lots about information, whether it be information integrity or digital public spaces, open data governance. We know that the world of data, the world of information is being transformed, and it's going to be part of the way in which democracy gets transformed. We talked a lot about how people's economic structure and incentives are going to affect democracy in future, whether it be through the provision of universal basic income or universal basic capital. Maybe we may well see social welfare reform and what does get provided by government to others in order for them to be economically surviving or successful. Antitrust policy. We also talked and prompted a lot by Sophie, things like stakeholder identification and stewardship, whether it be future generations or new innovations around democracy at planetary levels or rights for non-humans. We talked a lot throughout this process about whether we may well see rights for AI, we may well see rights for nature, for animals, for ecosystems, and how that might affect various different aspects of democracy. And then we also brought in this question of efficient and effective governance, talked about e-governance services, the way in which algorithms might affect governments and so on as well, and then lots of things around outcomes-based legislation. So there were plenty of different ways in which we try to encourage groups to think about innovations in various different ways. And the exercise that we then did with people was to give them a few of these ideas, maybe in a little more detail, and then say, well, what is it that a citizen assembly is? Where are we seeing it? What's going on around this? And then from there, we had a discussion about what the kind of advantages and disadvantages of a number of these might be. And so what we thought we'd do just for the last 5 or 10 minutes or so is to open up a conversation with you around just a few of these, and we'll take citizens assemblies as a kind of as a first example here. So many of you might know what a citizens assembly is. If you don't, kind of take a quick look at and read this. Groups of randomly selected individuals representing or kind of reflecting the diversity of our population, brought together to deliberate on a specific public issue. The assemblies, then they receive expert input, they engage in structured discussions, and then ultimately they kind of put some recommendations to some policymakers. Examples of this, Ireland had a citizens assembly, a key role in the legalization of same-sex marriage and abortion, and there's been citizens conventions proposing wide-ranging measures to reduce carbon emissions in France. Gideon's example there had a citizens panel on the question of trash and how that is dealt with in a local area. So what I thought we'd do is, so citizens assemblies very much a kind of a horizon 2. We're starting to see these things kind of emerge. Let me just open it up for a conversation here around upsides and risks of a citizens assembly. I'm going to stop sharing in a moment because we know the kind of questions here, and then we'll kind of go back to maybe some of the other innovations from there. But just when you think about citizens assemblies, what are you hopeful about? What attracts you to them? What might be some of the risks or unintended consequences? And then we also ask people, how might citizens assemblies combine with other innovations or innovation areas? So let me stop our conversation and maybe just ask you, citizens assemblies, if you think about them as a potential source of democratic innovation, what's exciting and hopeful about them to you? How do you react to them? And maybe on another side, what might be some of the unintended consequences that, even though we might be excited about this right now, maybe there are some things we need to kind of bear in mind? So anyone got any reactions to this question of citizens assemblies? What do we make of them? Laurie, let's go to you.
Yeah, so I've been a part of a lot of these, and I think they're fabulous. I think they're really important, and one of the reasons is because I think it engages people, and it gives, it's not just a voice, it's a participation that people are very excited about creating an outcome and creating something. The problem is that you can do a lot of work, a real lot of work, and then be ignored by the administration. So whoever you're appealing to. So I think that's a huge downside, because then everybody says, well, you know what, doesn't make any difference anyway. So then they kind of drop out. So those are just two real simple starters.
So almost, Laurie, I'm hearing kind of, in principle, fantastic, great experience. In practice, well,
no, even in practice, when you win, it's fabulous, so yeah.
I got you. All right, Jeff, let's go to you. Your thoughts on citizens assemblies.
So yeah, on the hopeful side, it's immediately increasing participation in the democratic process on that issue, but I think it also has kind of ripples of expanding participation and engagement, because other people can then know, oh, this is something citizens can do. My fellow citizens helped craft this. Like Laurie saying, the big danger is then if there is no pathway to actually adopting what comes out of that citizen assembly. So then it becomes just like a show. I think another possible danger is that it becomes as kind of a workaround for other deficiencies in the democratic representational process. That why can't our elected representatives do this? Because they're, beholden to campaign financing issues. So like I totally think they're a great idea and would think we need to do more and more of that, but don't just use it as a crutch for propping up other deficiencies in our democratic system.
Great perspective. Thanks. Shannon, over to you.
Great. Yeah. So I just wanted to echo a lot of the positives of citizen assemblies and in general, anything that improves the feedback loops between the governed and the governing, right? So I think it's a real opportunity to shape decision making so long as it's structured in a way to actually contribute to decision making. I do think a core tension in a lot of the deliberative democracy approaches is this tension between feedback and really having opportunities to gather citizen input and speed. And I think one of the things that we're finding, right, is that people are really frustrated because our system is not delivering results and solving problems that in some cases have, some real urgency. And so I just think a downside could be that we adopt processes that really enhance opportunities for feedback, but really slow down decision making and sort of gum up the system so much that it's hard to get things done.
Yeah, that managing that trade-off, absolutely. Mishi, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I've had limited experience with citizens assemblies, but from what I understand of the process, it feels like because of it avoids self-selection bias effectively, right? And it also allows participants to represent a wide range of gender and age and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, geographic diversity. And so in this way, it brings a number of different voices together to provide input into a process towards an outcome. Like many of the comments so far in terms of the shadow side, I agree that without a clear sense of how outcomes will be acted on, and there tends to be sort of a cherry picking when it's handed over to politicians to then make decisions about which things are integrated and moved forward. I also haven't seen yet, but wonder about the process for conflict resolution. So when there's rupture within the group, how does the facilitator sort of hold that and help folks move past it? So those are my observations. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mishi. I'm going to give the last word on this to Aditi, and then we'll go to a final wrap up from there. Aditi.
Just wanted to offer something on what Mishi was saying. Was my understanding is the pilots that have been done in the US have actually not avoided the self-selection problem, because people who are wanting to and so I really worry about the self-selection problem. In the US, we don't have a mechanism for mandating participation. And I think if you think about it like jury duty, it is a thing people work hard to get out of. And so that is my big concern about citizens' assemblies, that it would, I think in theory sounds like a great idea exactly for what you're saying about getting rid of the self-selection. But in practice, I think you'll see the same people who would be engaged through other means be engaged anyway.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, everyone. That was merely a taste of conversations that we had 30 times over in the session, where citizens assemblies was kind of one of the themes, and then citizen agents or future generations or others. And then what we tried to do was to say, look at all these things happening. How would we imagine that they might interact? As a result of that, where we then took the conversation was to say, what are you still interested in? We've talked about creating visions. We've thought about the future in various different ways. We've thought about these kind of Horizon 2 innovations. And so with all of that in our minds, this question then being, what do we want to work on? What are we curious about? And so I guess maybe to wrap up, and we'll bring kind of everyone right up to speed here, Kristen, I'm going to hand back over to you just to say where we are at the end of workshop 3 and now what the plans are for the sessions coming up in the next weeks and months.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Jonathan, if you can put my the slides back up, I will speak to the last one, which is really this question of curiosity. So as Shannon mentioned earlier, we are landing the plane of this project, but certainly not our commitment to this work. And so we've been trying to think about and understand from the group, what are you still curious about? Is it an idea or a topic? Is it a way of working? Is it a policy you want to change? Is it a practice that you want to introduce into your own foundation? What are you still curious about? And what would it take to turn that curiosity into a commitment? Whether that commitment is a new investment, whether it's a new way of working and thinking, whether it's a new habit or practice for you as an individual. And so we asked people just generally, we did a little exercise, we called it a back of a napkin exercise, where we just asked people to write down, like, what's one thing that's sticking with you that you want to see, learn, know, or do moving forward. And we themed those into, generally speaking, 5 categories that represent potential areas for future work. One was around AI and governance, which was really about using AI to meaningfully close feedback loops and improve service delivery. There was one about really this question, and Aditi and others helped us put a pretty fine point on it. If, 90+% of the work happening in the democracy field is in Horizon 1 for very legitimate and necessary reasons right now, what would it look like to increase investment in Horizon 2 and 3. I heard Aditi say one time in another context, if we're not planning for the future, we're seeding it. And so that's not to say that we should abandon Horizon 1, but we probably need to increase some focus and momentum into the others so that we're not just perpetuating this doom loop. So what would it look like to actually meaningfully do that? The third area that came up were really questions about how people become radicalized to anti-democratic behaviors, whether that's authoritarianism, whether it's misogyny, and what might it look like to disrupt some of those pipelines. The fourth was, and this one was really interesting, really a question of change is not going away. Disruption is not going to go away. Arguably, those things are going to become more complex. How do we build human resilience for that? We are not wired as humans to know how to withstand this amount of rapid change, much less process it in constructive ways. So what would it look like to harness human nature towards abilities to effectively navigate change and disruption? And then this last one that has come up a lot is this question of, what does it look like to build a positive vision? What is it that we are working toward? That might be a North Star. More likely, it's a constellation of North Stars. So how do we develop some of these visions and North Stars in ways that represent a lot of different things to a lot of different people and ensure that they aren't inherently in conflict when we do? So these are some areas of curiosity that we're going to keep exploring as a group. We will touch on them a bit in September and hope to have something to share a little bit more about specific interventions or initiatives that we'll be taking on to advance these conversations moving forward. So with that, we are right at time. I want to thank and appreciate all of you for being on this journey with us, being in the last 90 minutes with us. As always, please reach out if there's anything we can do to be supporting you, if you have any questions. And for those of you that are actively involved in the project, we will see you in September. For those who have been on this journey with us in a parallel way, we will hold another version of this reflection session after workshop 4. And we look forward to being in touch with you about that soon. Thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.